Hi everybody, it's Courtney. I'm here with another design team project for Not Too Shabby. Today I'm going to be using one of the new Simon Hurley stamp sets. This is called Bestest Friends. He has recently come out with a whole stamp line as well as some stencils and inks, so you definitely need to go check those out. I am going to be creating a one-layer card here, and I'm going to have an ink blended circle. So before I start my blending, or not my blending, my stamping, I'm just going to trace that circle, and this will basically just be a guide for where I need to place my images. So I'm using my Misty here to make this a little bit easier, being there's going to be quite a few layers within this little mini scene here. Whenever you stamp a scene, you're going to want to start with any images that are in front of another. So there's going to be basically more than one layer of stamping that you're going to be doing. So in this case, I used my masks just as a guide as to where I need to stamp out their little party hats. And for this little boy, he's going to be holding this birthday cake. Going to close my Misty door, remove those masks that I had placed down just for placement only, and then stamp out my first set of images. And I am using Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. I'll go ahead and mask out those first few images here, and then I will move on to the next row or layer of images. So I'm going to line up my little bear and my little boy, making sure that their little party hats match up, as well as that little cake there. Again, stamp these out with that same ink, and then I will mask these out as well. Now, when you're cutting masks for anytime you're doing ink blending, you're going to want to kind of be a little bit more careful with your masks. You're going to want to cut right along that black line to avoid any kind of white outline around your images once you do your ink blending. So once those were masked out, I'm going to then go ahead and stamp out this little tree stump here, as well as the first balloon. I'm going to end up stamping the balloon 3 times. I did cut a mask just for the balloon part itself, not really worrying about the balloon string at this point. But you'll just want to make sure that you're remembering to mask. I have forgotten to mask before I stamp my next image. You don't want to do that. So once everything was stamped and masked out, I am going to go ahead and erase any pencil lines that are still showing. Now, there are some pencil lines on the images itself, but now they're obviously masked out. But before I do my ink blending in the background, you want to make sure that you do erase those pencil lines. So once that was done, I am going to take that circle that we had in the beginning, and this is actually a piece of masking paper that is cut just a little bit larger than my card panel, just with any circle die. Go ahead and line that up, and I usually start in one corner or one end, and I'm starting right there on the bottom and kind of slowly working my way up to make sure that my mask lays flat. For my ink blending, I am going to be using Salty Ocean, Mermaid Lagoon, Twisted Citron, and Peacock Feathers. I'm going to be using my blending brushes here and starting off with the Twisted Citron on the bottom, moving up to the Cracked Pistachio, then the Peacock Feathers, and then the Mermaid Lagoon on top. Not really worried about getting a perfect blend the first time around. I kind of just lay out my color the first time. Once I reach the top, I'll move my way back down, and that's when I'll actually concentrate on getting my colors to blend. Sometimes I'll add some more ink to the blending brush, and other times I'll just go with whatever's on there just to make sure that the colors blend. I was going to go for a softer look, but ended up making this a little bit darker than maybe my initial intention. So I let this dry for about 5 minutes before removing my masks, and you want to do this very carefully, especially if you don't wait for the Distress Oxides to dry, because they kind of soak through the paper and they stay wet for a little while. Sometimes when you remove your masks, it tends to tear your paper as you're ripping up the masks. So you just want to be super careful and make sure that Distress Oxide is dry. I use the tip of my scissors to kind of get started on each of the masks and then peel the rest up with my fingers. Going to go ahead and erase the rest of those pencil lines that were on the images itself. And then I'm going to take an EK Success journaling pen and go over the balloon strings and any areas on my images that maybe were not covered up completely with my masks. The Distress Oxides tend to be a little bit more opaque. So if you go over your images, you're going to kind of lose that bold black line. So I just kind of darken those up with a Copic Safe pen. Also, I am going to take a Copic marker that closely matches whatever color is in the background for any of those white highlights that I have around my images where I either didn't cut the mask perfectly or I didn't line it up perfectly. But you can usually just go in with the tip of your marker and fill in those areas and nobody will ever know the difference. So we're going to move on to the coloring now, and I'm going to start off with the bear. And I have this sped up just a little bit because the coloring I kept a very, very simple, and the bear is kind of a large image. So I just basically wanted to show you where I put my shading. So I'm starting off with my lightest color to map out my darkest area. I'm just going to go in with a center highlight for this entire card. Going to add some shading on either side of him, also where his one arm is kind of tucked behind the rest of his body. Above his little snout there, underneath his hat would also cast a shadow onto his head, and on where the bottom of his belly, that would also cast a shadow because his belly would be a big belly and it would be sticking out. Also underneath the one arm that is extended, that is holding the balloons. Then I go in with my darkest color. My darkest color is the E29. Just go over those same areas that I had mapped out. And then I will extend these areas out with the E25. And here I'm using, depending on the area, if I have enough room, I'm using some flicking motions to get my blending to be a little bit easier. For the smaller areas, I'm basically just doing a straight line and I'll worry about the blending as I go along. Next is the E23, and I'm just extending these areas out even further. I am not coloring in his belly or his snout or the inside of his ears at this point. I am going to bring in a different color combination just to kind of make those a little bit different than the rest of his body. Finally, I'm going to go back in with that E21 and blend all of these areas out. And sometimes you may have a little bit of trouble blending. Just go over the same area more than once. You just want to kind of avoid going over the very, very darkest areas with your lightest color. The lighter the color it is, the more it will pick up or move around that darker color. And you want to try to avoid that because you'll lose your blending. So for his belly and his little snout, as well as the inside of his ears, I'm going to switch over to some E50 markers. Going to start off with the E53 to map out the darkest areas for his belly and his snout. It's going to be on either side because we are keeping a center highlight. For the inside of his ears, I just colored that in solid with the E53, not worried about any shading. The E57 will just go on either side of his little snout and belly. And then I realized these weren't blending very well. So I'm going to go back in with that E57, and instead of just doing those straight lines, I am going to flick the color out just a little bit and then go in with the E55 and flick it out even further. And this will allow your colors to blend a little bit easier. And when you're flicking, and I know this technique takes a little bit of practice, you want to kind of sweep away the color. So you're going to start with the tip of the marker right on that paper and sweep it away until it's no longer touching the paper with just the tip. So sometimes I'm barely touching that tip of the marker to the paper. Going to keep those E50 markers out for this little tree stump here, and I'm going to concentrate my shading being underneath where this little boy is standing because he would cast a shadow, and then on either side of the stump itself, because this would be a round object, it would definitely have a stronger center highlight. Going to go a little bit darker this time and bring in that E59, then blend that out with the E57, including that shadow underneath this little boy. Then go in with that E55 and then finish off with the E53. If it is a round object, I tend to keep a larger highlight than I maybe normally would. Usually a highlight color is a very minimal amount, where a rounder object, I typically add a little bit more to make that appear more round. So once that was colored in, I am going to move on to the skin tones for this little boy here. Again, going to go in with my lightest color, and I did mess up here. I started with my E00 as being my lightest color, and then the E04, E11, E01, and back to E00. but I accidentally picked up the wrong one. So I didn't end up having a highlight on his face. The E01 ended up being the lightest color just because I messed up. I did add a little bit of R20 to his cheeks just to give him a little color. I didn't do any shading on his little skinny little arms there. Don't even bother to try. For his hair, I wanted his hair to appear black, so I'm going to go right in with that black marker, add a little bit of a shadow underneath his party hat. His hair is not parted, but I did add a little bit of shading and flick out on either side to make it appear as if it was. He's got little bangs types things there. I'm not sure exactly what they would be called for a boy, but I'm adding some flick marks for going from the bottom up, and it's kind of wavy. So I'm going to go along with the shape of his hair to kind of keep the illustration the way it was intended. The C7 is my darkest mid-tone, then going down to the C5, and then the C3 will just be for the highlight. While I have my C markers out, I'm going to color in the cake itself. And again, this would be a round object, so I'm going to keep the center of the layers or the tiers of the cake white and just add some shading on either side. I initially started with the C3 and the C1, and I really wasn't, that highlight wasn't as intense as I would have liked it. So I ended up going in with the C5 and just added a teeny tiny bit on either side of the cake and then blended that back out with the C3 and C1. And this made it appear as if it was a round object more than just those two colors before. So next for his little pants there, again, very teeny tiny little area here. So I am not doing any blending here. I'm just going to go in with my B95, color those in solid, and then we'll move on to the balloons. Oh, I colored his little boots black too. So for this middle balloon here, I'm going to go in with some Y and YR markers, again, starting off with my lightest color. Going in with my darkest color, which is the YR68, and adding a little bit of shading on either side of the balloon, but just leave a little bit of highlight on the edge, and then go up towards the center or on the bottom up, I guess, if that makes sense to you guys. Blending that out with the Y38, and then the Y35, and then back to the Y04. Going to use this same color combination for this little bear's party hat, and I'm coloring directly over those little spots. I'll just use a darker color to color those areas in. Again, just concentrating my shading being on either side because, again, this would be a round object. So next, going to go on to the next balloon, and I'm going to bring in some R markers, and I'm going to be coloring this the same way. And I know that balloons are transparent, and you can definitely color right over that yellow to make it look like you can still see the red balloon behind it. I didn't bother to do that, but I also didn't bother to create a shadow where that yellow balloon is hanging over the red. I just colored this as if it was one full object behind it, just skipping over that red area, if that makes sense. But leaving that center highlight, or I'm sorry, the highlight on the edges. Using the Y or the R24 just for the little spots on this bear's party hat here, not doing any shading. I don't want to risk my R markers bleeding. They're impossible to get up. So switching over to some B markers for this third balloon, and I was using a 4-color blend, but found that the B18 and the B16 were a little bit too similar, so I wasn't going to get the contrast I was looking for. So I did end up bringing in a 5th color for this balloon, nowhere else in the card. And I'm using the B14, B12, and then back to that B00 for the highlight. While I have these markers out, I am also coloring this little boy's shirt with the same color combination. I am just going to skip the B18 because it is a really, really tiny area. You probably could get away with just 2 colors maybe for his shirt, but I did use 4, just skipping the really dark color. I found that the B16 was so close to the B18 that I really just don't think you'd notice it. Going to add some shading underneath the bottom part of his sleeves, and then on either side of him, just keeping that center highlight once again. Next, going to bring in some YG markers just to add a little bit different color here to his party hat, as well as these little scallops border, I guess, on this cake. Now there's two of them here, so I wanted to bring in two separate colors. Again, adding my shading on either side and keeping a center highlight, being this is a round object with the YG17, YG06, and YG01. For the other little scallop there, I guess, I'm going to bring back out those Y markers that I used. Again, skipping the darkest color. It's such a tiny area that I didn't want to risk any bleeding. For the candles, I'm going to go back in with that R24 and barely touching the paper here. So once all of my coloring was done, I'm going to add some white gel pen details. Oh, first I colored the plate that the cake is on with some W markers because I didn't want it to blend in too much with the rest of the cake. Here is where I'll go in and add some reflections to mainly the balloons, and this will make them appear a little bit more round and a little bit more shiny. And once that was done, I am going to go ahead and move on to the sentiment. I am lining up the sentiment on my grid mat here just to make sure it's straight. And then I'm going to stamp this off on a scrap piece of paper just to make sure that it is actually straight before I stamp it directly onto my card panel. And I'm stamping with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. Once that first part of the sentiment was stamped out, there's kind of different sentiments that you can use to build up. So I'm going to use this smaller one as well and stamp that directly under that happy birthday. I added a little bit of sparkle to the balloons, and I'm using a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen, and you'll just want to scribble this off on a scrap piece of paper when you're coloring over Copics. This tends to pick up the color a little bit. And then last I added some glossy accents to the balloons, and I added some to either side or the balloons on the outer edge, let it dry for about a half hour, and then added to the middle. Now I know my circle is not centered here, so I did end up trimming down my panel off to the right-hand side before adhering this to a card base. But that is it. That's the card for today. All supplies will be listed below, and don't forget that discount code. Have a great day, guys. Bye.